Greetings, microscopists. This is Eric Miller from Instructinate, and today I'd like to talk about 3D surface reconstructions of samples using the SEM. Now, to make a surface reconstruction, we'll need to use special software. There are several different pieces of commercially available software to do this. However, for this video, I'm not going to discuss any specific piece of software. We are instead going to discuss several different techniques in a general way and not get into whose software you should buy or avoid. I've used several different pieces of software to make reconstructions over the years, and I used to work very closely with one particular software company, so I feel I have a good grasp on most of the issues that would be important for customers such as you to know about. But I'm also going to be careful not to give away any trade secrets. You, on the other hand, are free to tell all of us which pieces of software you are currently using to do this work. So why use 3D reconstructions? What are some of the reasons someone might want to make a 3D reconstruction of their sample? Well, you can do all sorts of analysis on the surface of your sample once it's been reconstructed like this. Anything from Z height measurements to surface roughness to porosity to volume measurements. There are a lot of practical things you can do with this data. But the real reason we want to do this is because it's cool. Not only does it look cool, but you can also do cool things with the data, like sending it to a 3D printer. So why do this inside of an SEM? Well, number one is that it's much more accurate than doing something similar with a light microscope. We can go to higher magnifications and get better spatial resolution than we can with any light microscope. What kind of reconstructions can we do? There are two main methods that are commonly used today, and there are two others that I will mention that I think show some future promise. Stereo pair. This one is fairly quick and fairly simple to do. You just take one image of your sample, tilt the stage around 5 degrees, recenter your sample, and then take another image. That's basically it. Some software will give you the option to include 3 images, but 2 is fine. So what is good and bad about stereo pairs reconstructions? Pros: the Z measurements are going to be very accurate because the angles between the 2 or 3 images are known. The software will do a bunch of fancy trigonometry to make the 3D surface. It doesn't require any calibration of the instrument, it's just going to work. The other main bonus to this method is that it can handle high aspect ratio samples very well. So if you have a steep 90-degree drop-off on your sample, this method should be able to understand the surface and reconstruct it with no problems. And as I mentioned earlier, it's fairly easy to perform since all you need is an SEM stage that tilts, which about everybody here has. So what are the downsides? Well, unfortunately, it has several. First off, this method relies on the software being able to identify the same spot on the sample in both images. So for each pixel on image A, if the software can't find the corresponding pixel in image B, it freaks out. So if your sample has flat or featureless areas on it, this method is going to have some major problems. Now, that doesn't mean that it's unusable, but it might mean that you're going to end up spending a ton of time trying to clean up your data so that the reconstruction doesn't look like Tina Turner's hair in the Thunderdome. Because of this need to co-locate each point from both of the images or all 3 images, your data often has errors in it that require correction. This sometimes results in using a lot of smoothing filters to even things out, which of course modifies your data perhaps in a way you don't want it to be modified. So this technique works best if your sample is really busy. It's got lots of things happening on it. And it's just generally going to not like your flat or boring sample. The other issue that haunts this method is spheres. Because guess what? If you look at a sphere from 2 different angles, it still looks like a sphere. Because of this, the software has no way to recognize the sphere shape, and it usually just treats it as a flat area. Bottom line is that it's very easy to collect data, it's good with high aspect ratios, Z numbers are all very accurate because it's based on math. Unfortunately, it's really unusable on certain types of samples, and the resulting surfaces may require a lot of post-process massaging. The shadow method involves taking multiple directional images in the SEM, usually with a segmented backscatter detector, and using the shadows to calculate and reconstruct the actual surface of the sample. Currently, this is my personally preferred method. The shadow method excels where the stereo pairs method struggles. So in flat or featureless areas, we can get perfectly good reconstructions with very fine Z details. The technique can also be fairly simple to collect images for, as some microscope manufacturers have integrated the collection of the 4 directional BSE images into their GUI. So you only need to hit one button and all 4 images are captured simultaneously. But even if it's not, it's still not that big of a deal to take 2 or 4 directional BSE images, and you don't have to tilt your stage. However, in the areas where the stereo pairs method excels, this method struggles. The first one is that it doesn't do well with high aspect ratios on your samples. So if you have an area of your sample that is steeper than say 60 or 70 degrees, this technique will likely not render those areas very accurately. The other main complaint that people will point to is that the Z numbers will not be very accurate either. And in my experience, that is half true. And I say it's half true because there is a way to correct for it. The correction will likely be software specific, but there should be a way to calibrate your data so that the reconstructed Z numbers are more correct. Now, I suppose before you buy software to do this, that should be a question that you should ask. How do you calibrate the Z height in these shadow reconstructions? What it likely involves is putting a calibration sample into your SEM and taking images of it under the exact same conditions you took the images of your sample. You'll want to match the working distance and the voltage and possibly also the condenser lens and aperture settings. My experience has shown me that this makes the data much more accurate. Whoa, Eric, slow down there. You're throwing around these highly technical terms like accurate and more accurate. What do you mean by that? Well, without getting off onto a big discussion about accuracy versus precision, most of these software companies will say that their reconstructions will have an error rate of plus or minus 20% or maybe 25%. That means if the actual height of your structure is 100 and you take several measurements, you should get answers somewhere between 75 and 125. You may say that plus minus 25% is awful, and yeah, it's not great, but think about it this way. That accuracy range is about the same as a reconstruction you might get from a light microscope. But in this case, you're dealing with plus or minus 25% accuracy at 5000x in an SEM with SEM level resolution, where you'd be dealing with the same error rate at 500x on your light microscope with much lower spatial resolution. You're much better off in the SEM. Besides that, the calibration, if you're doing it right, I found to make very accurate data that was more in the range of plus or minus 5% error. Now, that is just anecdotal and could vary based on which software and which microscope you're using, but that is what I have seen personally. The last thing we'll mention is spheres. The shadow method handles spheres better than stereo pairs will, but it still has this weird problem with them. So first of all, the top of the sphere will usually come out fairly well rendered. Around the edges, where the aspect ratio gets kind of steep, may not be the best, but overall, it'll be fairly decent. However, the shadow method can only reconstruct surfaces that it can see. And you know what it can't see? The bottom half of this sphere. So the software assumes that the edge of the sphere and the substrate are in contact with one another. So you might get a decent looking sphere shape, but it will only be the top half of the sphere, meaning that the Z height will be 50% of the diameter, which is kind of hilarious, but it makes sense when you think about it. Photogrammetry. Most of you are likely familiar with what photogrammetry is. This involves moving a camera around an object or even around a room, and the software will construct a wireframe model of what the structure looks like and apply images to the surface. People have been saying that this is the next big thing in SEMs for a while now, but I haven't seen it yet. Not that there isn't software that couldn't handle this, the problem is the image acquisition. You would likely need a specialized substage to go into the SEM and rotate the sample around as images were being collected. You could do this manually, but it would take forever. Now, I might be wrong about all of this, but as far as I know, this is still something that's in the future as of 2025. Focus series, an SEM reconstruction of a focus series of images, I think is really cool. There are a slew of digital light microscopes that can do this extremely quickly already, like in 1 or 2 seconds, boom, it's done. You set the stage where you want to start, the stage moves, and it collects only the most in focus pixels to form an image, and based on the stage position, they're assigned Z height. That's great. There is also software available that will allow you to take as many images as you want with a known change in focus between each image, and it will generate a surface reconstruction for you. Fantastic. So what is potentially good about this method? First, your Z numbers would be very accurate, and it would handle high aspect ratios very well, just like the stereo pairs method. However, it probably wouldn't freak out over flat or featureless areas quite like the stereo pairs do. In my experience, you can end up with outlier pixels, like you often get with stereo pairs, but that can be mitigated a bit by running the microscope with the shortest working distance you can get and taking a lot of images. The downsides are going to be that the data collection in the SEM is likely going to be a bit time-consuming, and there will be small gaps in the Z data. I'll explain that in a minute, but let's first talk about how the data collection would work in the SEM. I see a few ways that it might. There may be other ways of doing this, but the option that I know actually does work is to capture and save a series of images with a known change in focus in between them. Anyone can do this right now manually. The problem is adjusting the focus the exact same amount after capturing each images and knowing exactly how much that change of focus actually is. You need to know down to the nanometer, and most instruments out there are not going to let you know that information. What you really need to do is to change the current in the objective lens a set amount and know exactly how much that changes the working distance. If that process could be automated, this method could be very good. Now, the reason this image collection might take a while is because you want the smallest change in focus you can get between the images. So to get a really nice surface, you might need to take 50 to 100 images. So why wouldn't it be smooth if I took fewer images? Well, one image will be in focus at this point, but in your next image is in focus here, you won't get a smooth transition between the two, you'll instead get a step. The smaller the focus is, the smaller the steps are, and the smoother the surface will be. This brings up the other major drawback with this method, which is that it will likely need to be washed through some smoothing filters to minimize the steps in the reconstruction. But due to the high level of Z accuracy, I think that this method shows a lot of promise. It just requires microscope manufacturers to put a little development into the automation. Single image reconstruction, one last thing I'll mention very briefly is the single image reconstructions. There are multiple pieces of software out there that offer this feature. It will take a single image and based on shadows in the image, it will construct a surface. Depending on the image, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. The main important thing to know about it is that any Z numbers that you get with this are 100% made up. This isn't really about getting good data from your surface, it's more about showing off what the surface probably looks like. Sometimes people just need this type of view to help them understand what's happening on the surface of the sample. So that's all I've got for you this time. Tell me what I got wrong or what I missed out in the comments. And let me know if you have any questions about making your own 3D reconstructions. I don't know, I might have a suggestion. Make sure you subscribe and share with all your other microscope buddies. And hey, this is Eric Miller from Instructinate, and I will see you around the lab.